Story 1: The Hitchhiker's Trap. Back in 2016, I was on a long drive to visit my parents, who had recently moved to the West Coast. The route was mostly barren, with only a few gas stations scattered across the long stretches of highway. My car, an old model that had seen better days, wasn't exactly reliable. On my second night of driving, my check engine light came on. Given the age and condition of my car, I wasn't too shocked, but it still wasn't a good sign, especially since I had minimal knowledge of cars. I checked my phone for the next gas station, 30 miles away. It was far, but I had no other option but to try and reach it. However, just when I was hoping for the best, my car gave up on me, coasting to a quiet stop on the roadside. I tried everything, restarting, checking under the hood, searching for any visible issues. Nothing worked. My phone had no signal, and after 30 minutes of frustrating attempts to get my car running, I realized I only had one option left: hitchhiking. I had never done it before, and it felt strange and unnerving, especially on a deserted highway in the middle of the night. But I didn't have a choice, so I stood by the road and stuck out my thumb whenever a car passed by, which wasn't often. Hours passed with only a few cars coming down the road. None stopped. By around 3 a.m., I was feeling exhausted and discouraged when a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. As the car drew closer, I stuck out my thumb, half expecting it to keep driving like all the others. But to my surprise, it slowed down and pulled over. The car was a black pickup truck. As I walked up to it, I saw the driver, a skinny man with a long, gaunt face and jet black hair, who flashed an unsettling grin at me. "Need a lift?" he asked cheerfully, his voice as off-putting as his smile. Something about him immediately set me on edge, but the reality of my situation overruled my gut instinct. I was tired, stranded, and desperate. So I climbed into the back seat, silently hoping it would be a safe trip. To break the silence, I asked what he was doing out here. "Just cruising," he replied with that strange smile, as though driving aimlessly down empty roads at night was a casual hobby. After a few more miles, he looked at me in the mirror. "You don't have any weapons on you, do you? Just making sure I'm safe," he said, his grin widening. I gave a small nervous laugh and shook my head. But the question rattled me. Why would he ask that? I didn't know if he was just being overly cautious, or if he had other intentions. Suddenly, without warning, he turned off the highway onto a dirt road. I sat up alarmed and asked where we were going. He didn't answer, his eyes locked forward as he continued down the rough path. My heart pounded as I gripped the door handle, ready to escape the moment he stopped. The truck bumped along the road until we approached a small, decaying farmhouse with its front door hanging open. Just as we reached it, he slammed on the brakes. I lurched forward as he jumped out of the truck and started heading around to my side. In a split second, I threw my door open and bolted for the tree line. The man chased after me, shouting for me to stop, but I didn't look back. Once I was deep in the woods, his footsteps faded and it was silent. except for his eerie voice calling out, "Come on, let's go back." I wasn't trying to scare you. I crouched behind a tree holding my breath. After a long tense wait, I slowly made my way back to the road, pulled out my phone and dialed 911. By some miracle, I had service. Eventually, I met with officers who were patrolling the area. They didn't find him or the farmhouse, just an empty road leading back to the highway. Story to the late-night passenger. On a quiet Monday night, I was doing a short DoorDash shift after my regular job. It was around 10 p.m., and I was about 20 minutes out of town, delivering my last order for the night. As I drove through the dimly lit farmland, I noticed a figure standing in the road ahead. I slowed down and the man stepped aside, sticking out his thumb, clearly asking for a ride. He looked worn out, like he hadn't slept in days, and carried a heavy backpack on his shoulders. Something about him seemed odd, but I figured I'd be kind and give him a lift, since I was heading into town anyway. Without hesitation, he opened the passenger door and slid in next to me, instead of taking the back seat. It caught me off guard, but I brushed it off. As he settled in, I glanced in his direction and asked, "You from around here? What brings you out to these parts?" He muttered something about crossing the country to visit family, adding that he didn't have a car and had been hitching rides. I asked a few more questions, but his responses were vague, and he barely looked at me, keeping his eyes locked on the back seat, as though he were looking for something. The atmosphere grew tense as his silence stretched on. I tried to brush it off, but then I noticed him clutching something in his right hand. My blood ran cold when I realized it was a knife. He turned to me and in a low voice said, "Stop the car." I tried to keep my composure and pulled over, my heart pounding. I was terrified, unsure of what he wanted or what he was planning to do. As soon as I stopped, he commanded me to get into the back seat. I was frozen, weighing my options. If I complied, he might do something far worse once I was trapped in the back. Instead, I took a deep breath, opened the door and bolted out of the car. He lunged at me but missed, and I dashed into the tall grass, not stopping until I was hidden. I could hear him shouting, but I kept quiet, crouching low and hoping he would give up. Minutes later, when everything went silent, I cautiously made my way back to the car. The headlights were still on, illuminating the empty road, but the man was gone. I grabbed my phone, called 911 and told them everything. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found nothing. The man had vanished, leaving only his footprints and the unnerving memory of the encounter. Story 3: A ride through the dark late one evening. I was driving home from a friend's house in Wisconsin. I had stayed longer than planned, and by the time I hit the road, it was nearly 8 p.m. The 6-hour drive stretched ahead of me, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself on empty, forest-lined roads that seemed to go on forever. The solitude and monotony of the drive were taking their toll on me, and it wasn't long before fatigues started setting in. Around 11 p.m., I noticed a figure on the side of the road, with their thumb out, a solitary silhouette against the dense woods. My first thought was that some company would help keep me awake, so I slowed down and rolled down my window. The figure stepped closer, and I saw a man, maybe in his 30s, looking haggard and carrying no visible luggage. He asked if I could give him a lift to the next town, and without much thought I agreed, hoping the conversation would keep me alert. He climbed into the back seat, and we set off. After a few minutes of silence, I asked him where he was headed. He flashed a forced smile and said, "Just got lost while hiking the trails." I found his story odd, considering there were no known trails in this remote area. As we drove on, I caught him glancing toward the back seat several times, each time with a strange intensity. The silence felt heavy, and I was beginning to regret picking him up. Then abruptly he told me to stop the car. I complied, pulling over, and he quickly jumped out, disappearing into the woods without a word. Relieved, I prepared to drive off, when I noticed a drawstring bag left behind under the passenger seat. Curious and slightly worried, I leaned back to inspect it. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a dark red stain seeping through the bag. I immediately called 911, describing the man and his peculiar behavior. When the police arrived, they took the bag for testing and searched the area. But the man was gone. The encounter left me shaken, and I drove home with a nagging sense of unease, wondering what dark secrets that bag might have held.